Imagine scrubbing toilets for 14 years, believing you're a burden to your family. Then a federal agent says, your real parents would trade every million in the world just to see your face. My stepfather stole my life and built a fortune on my money. Right now, he's trying to kidnap me again, right from the FBI office. But he forgot I'm not that terrified girl anymore. Today, I'm taking everything from him, down to the last cent. You can't leave. The clerk's whisper was sharper than a scream. I stood at the high marble counter of the federal building in Memphis, clutching $12 and a crumpled eviction notice. I only needed a passport stamp to secure a night shift custodial job. Instead, a silent alarm began to pulse a violent, rhythmic red against the walls. 2 armed marshals stepped forward, their hands hovering over their holsters. The clerk said, her voice trembling. This social security number belongs to a child who was declared deceased in 1994. My world tilted. Dead? I was standing right there, breathing the stale air of the lobby. But before I could protest, the elevator doors hissed open. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, cutting through the security perimeter as if the building were his private residence. He didn't acknowledge the guards. He looked directly at me with an expression that chilled me more than the drawn weapons. It was recognition. He stopped a few feet away and uttered 3 words that effectively erased my entire existence. Welcome back, Ivy. If you found out your entire life was built on a foundation of lies, would you run, or would you stay to find out who you really are? I wasn't thrown into a holding cell. I wasn't cuffed to a cold steel table bolted to the floor. Instead, the man, Agent Miller, led me into a quiet, soundproofed office that smelled of rich tobacco and expensive leather. He didn't read me my rights. Instead, he poured a glass of ice water and set it on the heavy mahogany desk with a gentleness that felt entirely foreign to me. Drink, he said. You're in shock. I took the glass, the ice rattling against the rim as my hands shook. I was 32 years old. I had spent the last 14 years scrubbing floors, waiting tables, and dodging debt collectors, convinced I was nothing more than the unwanted stepdaughter of a small-town sheriff in rural Tennessee. I believed I was Sloane, the error, the ghost, the burden. Miller slid a leather-bound folder across the desk. He didn't open it immediately. He simply rested his hand on the cover. We've been looking for you for nearly 30 years, Ivy, he said softly. He flipped it open. It wasn't a mugshot inside. It was a digital rendering, an age progression photo of a young woman. She had my eyes, my jawline, the exact curve of my nose. But she didn't look exhausted. She looked cherished. That is who you were meant to be if you hadn't been taken, he said. Your name is Ivy Vance. Your family built a thoroughbred empire in Kentucky, and they would trade every acre of their land just to see your face again. You were kidnapped from a garden in 1994. The room spun. I gripped the leather armrests of the chair to ground myself. Kidnapped. The word should have been a nightmare, but instead, it felt like a key turning in a lock I'd been picking at my entire life. Suddenly, the years of cruelty made sense. I thought of Gideon, the man I'd called my stepfather, the sheriff who told me I was garbage, who made me sleep on a folding cot in the basement while his biological daughter, Harley, lived like a princess in the master suite. I had always assumed he hated me because I was a difficult child, or that I was simply unlovable. But he didn't hate me for who I was. He hated me because I was a crime scene. Tears came then, hot and stinging. It wasn't fear. It was the overwhelming, bone-deep relief of realization. I wasn't broken. I wasn't a mistake. I was a stolen treasure that someone had tried to bury. Miller seemed to sense the shift. He pushed a sleek smartphone across the desk toward me. Your parents, your real parents, are on a private flight right now. They'll be on the ground in 20 minutes. You're safe here, Ivy. This is federal ground. No one can touch you. I looked at the phone. It was a lifeline. For the first time in my life, the floor beneath my feet felt solid. I wasn't the girl with the eviction notice anymore. I was Ivy Vance, and I was going home. I reached for the screen, ready to end the long nightmare. I finally let my guard down. I finally allowed myself to believe the fight was over. That was my mistake. The door didn't just open, it was kicked inward. 2 uniformed deputies charged in, hands on their weapons, their heavy boots thudding against the polished floor. And behind them, walking in as if he were entering his own living room, was Gideon. He wasn't wearing his usual grease-stained work shirts. He was in his full-dress uniform, the silver star on his chest gleaming under the office lights. He ignored Miller, focusing his dead, cold eyes on me. Step away from the suspect, he barked. Miller stood, positioning himself between me and the deputies. This is a federal investigation, Sheriff. You have no jurisdiction here. This is a federal investigation, Sheriff. You have no jurisdiction here. Gideon didn't even blink. He slapped a folded document onto the mahogany desk. I have a warrant signed by a county judge 10 minutes ago. Grand larceny, felony charges. He pointed a thick finger at me, the same finger that had poked my chest 1,000 times throughout my childhood. That woman stole $50,000 worth of heirloom jewelry from my wife's bedroom before she fled this morning. I'm taking her into custody. That's a lie. I screamed, the shock finally shattering. I haven't stepped foot in your house in years. Gideon sneered, his lip curling in contempt. Save it for the judge. Cuff her. One of the deputies grabbed my arm, wrenching it behind my back with enough force to make my shoulder pop. I cried out, the pain blinding and white. Miller moved to intervene, his hand reaching toward the inside of his jacket, but Gideon stepped in close, chest to chest with the federal agent. Careful, agent, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory rumble. This is a state crime, and these are exigent circumstances. Unless you want to be on record for obstructing a felony arrest, you'll step aside. You can interview her after we've processed her at the county jail. Miller hesitated. I could see the cold calculation in his eyes. He knew the law. He knew that, technically, a local felony warrant could override his authority if they claimed I was a flight risk. And Gideon knew it, too. He was weaponizing the very bureaucracy meant to protect me. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into my wrists. The sharp click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the quiet office. I didn't steal anything, I pleaded, looking at Miller. Please, don't let him take me. You said I was safe. Miller's face was taut with fury, but he didn't draw his weapon. He couldn't risk a shootout with local law enforcement in a federal building over a property crime warrant. Gideon had played his hand perfectly. The sheriff gripped my arm, his fingers already bruising the skin. He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear, his voice a whisper intended only for me. I told you, he hissed. I told you never to dig. I told you to leave it alone. Now you're going to die in a holding cell, Sloan. You'll be hanging from a bedsheet before your rich parents even touch the tarmac. The blood drained from my face. He wasn't taking me to jail to book me. He was taking me there to execute me. Move! He shouted, jerking me toward the door. The hallway stretched out like a long, sterile tunnel. Fluorescent lights blurred overhead as the deputies half-dragged, half-marched me toward the elevators. My boots skittered on the polished linoleum. Gideon's hand was a vice on my bicep, his fingers digging into the tender space between muscle and bone. That grip. I knew that grip. It wasn't the first time he had marched me out of a door. Suddenly, the federal hallway dissolved. I was 18 years old again, standing on the porch of the only home I'd ever known, clutching a single garbage bag filled with my clothes. It was raining. I was shivering, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that I had nowhere to go. Through the bay window, I could see them eating dinner. Gideon and his biological daughter, Harley. They were cutting into thick, rare steaks. The warm yellow light of the chandelier glinted off the crystal glasses. I had just eaten a dry sandwich made from the heel of a loaf because Gideon said steak was for people who contributed. I remembered knocking on the glass, begging to come back in just for the night. Gideon had opened the door, looming over me exactly as he was doing now. "You should be on your knees thanking me," he had said, his voice dripping with that sick, self-righteous poison. "I kept a roof over your head for 10 years. I fed you. I clothed you. And you weren't even my blood. Do you know what a burden you were, Sloane? Do you know how expensive it is to keep a mistake?" And I had believed him. God help me, I had believed him. I had fallen to my knees on that wet concrete and thanked him for the scraps. I had spent the next 14 years carrying the weight of that debt, believing I was unworthy, believing I owed the universe an apology just for existing. But that was the trap. The realization hit me harder than the handcuffs. It wasn't charity, it was camouflage. He hadn't been raising a stepdaughter. He had been hiding a witness. Every time he made me feel small, every time he told me I was lucky he hadn't thrown me into the street, he was grooming me. He needed me broken so I wouldn't ask questions. He needed me desperate so I wouldn't look at my own birth certificate. He wasn't my savior. He was my warden. The fear that had been choking me since I walked into the building evaporated. It didn't just fade, it was incinerated by a white-hot flash of pure, clarifying rage. He thought he was dragging a scared little girl to jail. He thought he was handling Sloane, the burden. But Sloane didn't exist anymore. I dug my heels into the tile. I stopped fighting the deputy's grip and instead went completely limp, dropping my entire body weight to the floor. It's a trick you learn when you've spent years moving heavy furniture on your own. Dead weight is a physics problem most people aren't prepared to solve on the fly. The sudden drop caught them off guard. The deputy on my left stumbled, his fingers slipping from my arm. We jerked to a halt 10 feet from the elevator bank. "Get up!" Gideon snarled, yanking on my shoulder. "Stop making a scene." I didn't get up. I planted my feet and slowly straightened my spine, pulling against the handcuffs until the short chain was taut and biting into my skin. I turned my head and looked directly into Gideon's eyes. For the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I looked right at the man who had stolen my life, and I let him see exactly what he had created. The victim was gone. The witness was finally awake, and she was about to burn his world to the ground. "Check the timestamp," I screamed. The sound tore through the lobby, echoing off the marble walls like a gunshot. It wasn't a plea for help, it was a command. The deputies hesitated, looking down at me in confusion. In that split second of uncertainty, I found my opening. I didn't try to stand. I locked eyes with Miller, who was already sprinting toward us, his hand reaching for the radio on his shoulder. "The warrant!" I yelled, my voice cracking but projecting across the room. "Check the time he signed it." Gideon kicked my leg, hard. "Shut her up. Get her in the elevator." But it was too late. Miller didn't slow down. He didn't ask for permission. He threw his entire weight against the elevator doors just as they were sliding shut, forcing them back open with a violent screech of protesting metal. Two uniformed Federal Protective Service officers materialized from the security checkpoint, their hands on their weapons as they blocked Gideon's path. "Hold it!" Miller barked. His voice was no longer the calm, soothing tone he'd used in the office. It was the voice of a man who commanded federal task forces. "Nobody moves. This is obstruction of justice." Gideon roared, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "I am a sheriff, and I am executing a lawful arrest." "Let me see the warrant," Miller demanded, holding out his hand. He didn't ask. He waited. Gideon clutched the paper to his chest for a heartbeat, the unmistakable tell of a poker player hiding a losing hand. Then, realizing he had 3 federal barrels pointed in his direction, he shoved the crumpled paper at Miller. "Read it and weep, Agent. Grand larceny, signed by Judge Miller this morning." Miller snapped the paper open. He scanned it once, then looked up at the digital clock above the security desk. Finally, he looked at the security monitors behind the guard station. "You're sloppy, Gideon," Miller said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet calm. He turned the paper around so the deputies could see it. "This warrant was signed at 8:00 a.m. sharp." He pointed a finger at the security monitor on the wall. "But my building's cameras logged Ivy entering through the north metal detectors at 7:45 a.m. The lobby went dead silent. "She's been in federal custody since the moment she walked in," Miller said, stepping closer to Gideon. "Unless she can teleport, she couldn't have stolen jewelry from your house at 8:00 if she was standing in my lobby 15 minutes earlier." The deputies holding me loosened their grip. They looked at each other, then at Gideon. They realized they weren't executing an arrest, they were accomplices to a kidnapping in progress. "It's a typo," Gideon shouted, spittle flecking his lips. "The clerk made a mistake on the time. She stole it last night." "The warrant says this morning," Miller countered. "And if you lied on a sworn affidavit to get this signed, that's perjury. If you're trying to drag a federal witness out of here on falsified charges, that's kidnapping." Miller signaled to his guards. "Release her. Now." The deputies let go of my arms as if I were made of fire. I scrambled backward across the floor, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the man who had stolen my life. Gideon stood alone in the center of the circle, his face a mask of purple, vein-popping rage. He looked at his deputies, who were already backing away. He looked at Miller, who was staring him down with cold contempt. He looked at me, standing up, rubbing my bruised wrists, no longer the scared girl he could bully into silence. He realized he couldn't talk his way out of this. His authority didn't work here, and that was the moment he finally broke. "I'm not leaving without her," Gideon screamed. His hand flew to his belt. He didn't draw his service pistol. He knew that would get him killed instantly. Instead, he ripped his taser from its holster, the yellow plastic gleaming under the lobby lights. He leveled it at Miller. "Back off." he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. I'm taking custody of this suspect. Anyone who interferes gets dropped. He was insane. He was holding a federal agent at gunpoint in a federal building. But I looked at his eyes, wide, frantic, and wild, and I realized he wasn't trying to arrest me anymore. He knew it was over. He was just trying to survive the next 5 minutes. The guards reacted instantly. 3 Glock 17s snapped up, their muzzles trained directly on Gideon's chest. Drop the weapon, Miller ordered. Now. For a heartbeat, it looked as though Gideon might force them to pull the trigger out of sheer, petty spite. Then the madness seemed to drain from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating sheen. He wasn't a martyr. He was just a bully who had finally run out of room to push. He tossed the taser onto the marble floor and slowly raised his hands. Fine, he sneered, his voice recovering its oily confidence. Let's do this properly, then. He reached into his jacket. The guards tensed, but he pulled out a document, snapping it open with practiced flair. You court me, Gideon said lightly. The warrant was a fabrication. I knew about the kidnapping. I helped facilitate the cover-up. He looked straight at me, a cruel smile stretching across his face. I kept you. I hid you. I stole every potential version of your life. Miller stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs. That's a full confession. You're under arrest. Gideon let out a short, jagged laugh. No, I'm not. Check the calendar, Agent. The kidnapping happened in 1994. The statute of limitations for the state and federal charges expired back in 2014. The room went dead silent. Miller froze, his hand hovering over his belt. Gideon seized the moment, stepping forward with a predatory grace. You can't touch me for the kidnapping or the fraud. I walk out that door, and legally, Sloan is still a ward of my estate. I control your assets. I control your future. He turned toward the exit, his shoulders squared. I'm suing every one of you for civil rights violations. You're right about the statute, Miller said calmly, stopping him mid-step. But you forgot one fundamental rule. Gideon frowned, looking back over his shoulder. And what would that be? Miller lifted a thick, blue-tabbed file from the security desk. The constructive trust doctrine. Gideon's expression faltered. You don't own property obtained through criminal fraud, Miller continued. Legally, you simply hold it in trust for the victim. The file hit the marble bench with a heavy thud. We traced the ransom payments, the foster stipends, the offshore investments you made using her identity. We have 30 years of paper trails. That's my money. Gideon snapped, the composure finally cracking. No, I said, stepping forward until I was only inches from him. You just managed it for me. Miller's voice was as cold as a mountain stream. Civil fraud doesn't expire when the victim was a minor at the time of the crime. Your assets are frozen. Your house is seized. Every cent in your accounts belongs to the woman you stole from. He pointed at me. It all belongs to Ivy. Gideon recoiled, a look of genuine terror washing over his face. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was terrified of being nobody. He was terrified of being poor. But I'm the sheriff. He screamed. You laundered money and filed false tax returns for 3 decades, Miller cut in. Those clocks are still running, and the IRS doesn't care about your star. The guards moved this time with purpose. Gideon shrieked as the cuffs snapped shut, the sound of his authority finally breaking. "You're nothing," I whispered as they began to lead him away. The lobby fell quiet. Miller slid a single sheet of paper toward me, an asset transfer authorization. "Sell it all," I said, my hand steady as I signed my real name for the first time. "Just make sure he never has a home to go back to." I had nothing left but the clothes on my back, but for the first time in 32 years, I was free. Golden sunlight flooded the lobby as the heavy glass doors swung open. 2 figures rushed in, their faces blurred by the tears in my eyes. I didn't need a DNA test. I didn't need a folder of evidence. I felt the truth of it in my very bones. "Ivy?" the woman whispered, her voice trembling with a lifetime of grief. "Oh, God. Ivy, I'm here." They reached out and held me as if they would never let go, shielding me from the world. For the first time in my life, I wasn't a burden. I was home.